is basic to our existence. Without an ample supply of water, there's no development. Ensuring clean water takes the collaboration of business, of government, and communities. Climate change and population growth is putting increasing pressure on existing water resources. Water law has grown in sophistication and complexity over the years. Here in studio to help us better understand this complex subject is our guest, Jeffry Gittins, water law attorney from Smith Hartvigsen. Jeff, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Jeff, let's get started by telling us the difference between a water law attorney and a regular attorney.
Well, as with many areas of law, there's attorneys that specialize in certain things, just like there's bankruptcy attorneys that specialize in helping people through the bankruptcy process, or criminal defense attorneys that help people through the process when they're charged with a crime. Water law attorneys assist people with their water law issues. I always tell people as a water law attorney, my job is to help people understand and protect their water assets, which are their water rights, their water shares, and their water systems.
Sure. How did you become interested in the subject?
So I grew up on a dairy farm up in Cache Valley. Our family had several hundred irrigated acres. So my introduction to water law was moving sprinkler pipe. And later on, as I got to be older, my dad was the president of our local irrigation company, and his name was also Jeff. And people would call and ask for Jeff, and my siblings would hand me the phone, and someone would start yelling at me about their water or lack of water. And I guess I figured if I was going to get yelled at about water, I might as well get paid for it. So,
indeed. That's a logical introduction. Why is there a need for a water law attorney or attorneys?
So water law has its own special rules, its own laws, its own administrative process, and frankly, almost its own language. A lot of times what we're doing is effectively interpreting between our clients and the Division of Water Rights or other water regulators and helping bridge that gap of understanding.
Mm-hmm. So is that essentially the purpose of water law, or does it go much deeper than that?
So the purpose of water law, because water is a very limited resource in our state, we are the second driest state, second only to Nevada. We have to make sure that that limited resource gets allocated in the best way possible. And so water law is really set up to allocate that scarce resource between a lot of different users and a lot of different interests, and making sure that people get the water they're supposed to get in the priority they're supposed to get it.
Indeed. Well, you say we're the second driest state in the country, but yet the Wasatch Range by itself will generate sometimes 500 to 600 inches of snow a year. What becomes of that water? Is it to go elsewhere?
No, our water stays here in the state for the most part. We use a lot of our water. It's just there's a lot of demanding uses. There's agriculture, there's mining, there's domestic and culinary water use, municipal use, and then obviously we need water just for in-stream flow, for environmental purposes. So there's a lot of need for water for a lot of different industries and reasons.
Is water law the same from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, from state to state?
No, water law differs from state to state. Many Western states follow the same general principles of water law, but a lot of it is administrative. So what we call one thing here in Utah, they may call something different in Idaho. The same general legal principles are the same in the Western United States, but the Eastern United States follows a totally different system than we do.
I see. Well, who's the ultimate administrator or enforcement entity of water rights or water law?
So the very first statute in our water law statutes here in Utah tells us that all water, whether above ground or below ground, is property of the public, administered by the state. So the state is the ultimate holder of water, and it's the Utah Division of Water Rights is the agency tasked with administering water, approving water applications, and making sure people, again, get the water they're supposed to get in the priority that they're supposed to get it.
Well, so does that mean that Utah owns all the water in the state, essentially? Are they the ultimate owner?
Ultimately, yes, that they hold all of the water in public trust for the benefit of the public because it's a limited resource. We don't want the tragedy of the commons that you may have heard about to occur, and so the state is the one that administers and decides who has rights to use water.
What is the tragedy of the commons?
The tragedy of the commons is when you have a limited resource that, if it's not properly managed, ultimately, if everyone's just looking out for their own self-interest, that limited resource will get used up or used incorrectly. It comes from back in the old days when they had common grazing areas, and they found out that they ended up getting overgrazed because everyone was looking out for their own beneficial interest and not the group as a whole.
Which we would tend to do. What are water rights? I've heard that term frequently. What definitely does water rights mean?
So a water right is a right granted by the state to use a specific amount of water at a specific place from a specific source for a specific use. So if you have a water right, that is the state telling you that you can divert a certain amount of water from a certain source, whether that's a spring or a well or the Weber River, and use it at a specific place for a specific use, whether that's culinary use or irrigation or stock watering or mining or whatever that use may be. But it's that right granted by the state to use water.
And is that for a specific period of time? A day, a month, a week, a year?
Yes. Also part of that would be the period of use, which is when you're allowed to use the water. Some water rights you may be able to use all year long. Some, like irrigation rights, you may be able to use only from April to October.
I see. And that's mandated by state statute.
Yep. Each water right will have its own characteristics.
I see. And so what's the difference between water rights and water shares?
So a water right is a right granted directly by the state to use some of the state's water. And a water share is a share in an irrigation company, canal company, ditch company, whatever it may call itself. In that situation, there's still water rights involved. The company owns the water rights that they were issued by the state, and then they issue shares to their shareholders. And as a shareholder, you're entitled to use your proportionate share of the company's water. So if I'm a shareholder in an irrigation company and I have 10% of the shares, then I get 10% of the company's water under their water rights.
And how are these water companies created? Are they a creation of the government?
Not of the government. Most of them were created long ago when the pioneers first showed up and they needed to start watering rather than everybody building their own separate ditch for miles and miles. They banded together and would build a large canal to carry water. And so they pooled together their resources, their time, effort, money, water rights, and formed these companies. So a lot of them have been around for a long time. Companies are still created now, but a lot of these water companies were created, a decade plus or a century or plus ago.
You mentioned specific water allocations based on rights or ownership privileges. How is that water determined? What is when you own water rights, is there a specific body of water from which, or a spring or a well or a river from which that water would originate? Yeah,
so part of your water right will tell you which source or sources you're allowed to divert your water from. So it may be a well or even several wells or a specific spring or a specific river or creek. So part of your water right is telling you which source you're allowed to take water from.
And I've heard the term riparian rights. What does that mean?
So riparian rights is the system that the eastern United States uses. That is a system of water allocation under which if your land touches water, you get to use water. That works really well where you have lots of water. That doesn't work well out here in the arid West. If you can imagine that the only people that could use water out of the Weber River were people whose land actually touched the Weber River, we would not be able to grow and use our water the way we need to out here in the arid West. So we follow the prior appropriation form of water allocation, which is that the first person to start using water gets to keep using water. It's not based on whose land touches water, but who started using water first.
So based on that interpretation, I gather that if a stream runs through your land, you may have certain rights to some of that water, but not necessarily in total control of it.
Just because a stream runs through your property or there's a spring on your property doesn't mean you have the right to use it. You still have to have a water right granted by the state to use it. Because if you just started using water rights or started using water out of a stream, that's water that wouldn't make it downstream to someone who has rights to it.
I see.
So, there's an old saying in water. We have lots of great saying in water, and one is it's better to have stealing rights at the head of the ditch than water rights at the end of the ditch. That would certainly apply here, and we don't want that to happen. So, yes, if you have a stream or a spring through your property, you can't use it unless you have a water right.
What about drilling rights? Do we have the right to drill for water on our own land and utilize that water at our discretion?
Same thing. You have to have a water right for it. So if you want to drill a well and use water on your property, you need a water right granted by the state to have that well and use that water.
One of the questions I have, and I think you've addressed it to a certain extent, but quite simply, who has the right to manage or divert or to use or sell water? And I sense that there are perhaps multiple answers to that, such as the original user.
Yeah. So ultimately, it's the state, the Division of Water Rights, that grants water rights and determines who has those rights at the outset. After that, then, as a water right holder, if I own a water right, then I get to choose if I want to sell it or lease it or do something different with it. And if I want to do something different, I have to go back to the state and ask for approval to change how I'm using my water. So, for example, if I have a water right that allows me to irrigate, and I say, well, I don't want to irrigate anymore, I want to use my water for homes, I have to go back to the state and file what's called a change application and get their approval to change how I'm using my water. So it starts with the state, goes to the water right owner, and ultimately comes back to the state when things change.
Mm-hmm. Do water rights have all the normal or legal characteristics of personal property? For example, can a water user transfer, sell, lease, whatever rights they have? But it sounds like they have to go back to the state to approve that transaction.
So largely, water rights are similar to real property. The one difference is that water rights are usufructuary rights, which is a really fancy term to say a right to use. So real estate is a more absolute right of ownership. If I buy land and I just decide I'm not going to do anything with it for 50 years, that's my right. 50 years later, the land will still be there, I will still own it, and everything will be fine. With water rights, because again, we're dealing with a limited resource that belongs to the public, if I own a water right, what I have is the right to use some of that water. And if I am not using it, then that's where the state can come in based on law, where the water right can be taken from me for lack of use. So that's the one big difference between water rights and real estate, is that water rights can be lost due to non-use.
So they are transferred separate from the land then?
They can be.
Can be.
So generally speaking, water rights are considered appurtenant or attached to land. So the law presumes if I sell you land, the water is going to go with it. And that's when you're also looking at the standard real estate purchase contract, that's the presumption that's made in that as well, that all of the water is going with it unless it's specifically excluded. So if I want to sell you the land but not the water, I need to do certain things to make sure that that doesn't happen. But I can transfer water separate from land. The law just presumes if nobody says anything about it, the water's going with the land.
Who or what is the biggest user or consumer of water in Utah?
So overall, agriculture uses the most water. Irrigation as a whole uses a lot of water. So agriculture and then watering lawns and gardens use a lot, just because irrigation uses a lot more than, say, stock watering or domestic culinary use. Mm-hmm.
How would a landowner, if the one purchased a small parcel of land, perhaps it's undeveloped, how would you go about determining whether you have either water rights or water shares?
So there's a way to look, and if you're looking for water rights, you can go to the Division of Water Rights website. They have a database of all water rights in the state, and there are several different ways you can search. You can search by name. You can look on a map and look for points of diversions or wells. You can search by place of use. You can search by the name of the water source. So there's lots of different ways you can search on there for water rights. If you own water shares, then you should know that because you're paying assessments each year. If you own shares in a water company, the way they operate is they have to assess their shareholders each year to pay for operation, maintenance, all those things for their system. And so you should know, or the seller should know whether there's shares associated with it because they'll be paying assessments to an irrigation company each year.
So that information with water shares would surface in the documentation. Or I guess the other way is to contact a water law attorney to advise and counsel through the process.
Right. And as you're buying property as part of the seller's disclosures, they have to provide information about water rights and water shares. So if you're buying property, you want to review those disclosures and make sure you understand what it is you'll be getting when you purchase the property.
If a developer builder is optimistic about creating a new subdivision, then I presume that there is a jurisdictional issue that has to be inquired or secured permission to utilize whatever water that may be available and would be needed to develop that. And does that go all the way to the state, or are those local jurisdictions?
So a lot of that is dependent on the local jurisdiction about what they will require. So a lot of cities, if I want to develop land and get water service from the city, I have to give the city water rights, so the city has water rights that it can use to serve that development. So one of the things I do, I represent a lot of cities and towns on their water rights. And so when a developer comes in and says, we want to do a development and here's the water we would like to give to the city to meet our water dedication requirements, my job is to review those water rights to make sure they will work for the city, and then fill out the change application and go to the state and say, we want to change this water. It used to be used for irrigation. Now we want to use it through the city system for culinary use and get that approval.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that at some point one may lose their water rights if they're not used. How long of a process is that?
So that has to be through a court action. It doesn't just happen automatically.
But would it be if one doesn't use their water for a year or 2 years or 10 years, or is there a specific period of time?
Yes, it's 7 consecutive years. So if someone has not used their water for 7 consecutive years, it's subject to forfeiture, meaning they run the risk that someone could take them to court and prove that they haven't used the water for 7 years, at which point the court could rule that the water has been forfeited and that water right would be gone. The person who brought the suit doesn't necessarily get the water. It just means the person who had the water no longer has it. It's invalid.
Back to the drilling concept, it would appear if you had 2 contiguous properties and one property had an existing well and another property drills a new well, it's very likely that same underground body of water will be providing both sources. Are there laws that deal with that?
Yeah, so part of that, remember we talked about the change application process where you have to go back to the state and get approval to change something. So through that process, you're going to have the state looking at it to make sure that what you want to do isn't going to interfere with someone else's water rights. Also, there is a public notice process where notice of all those applications is given, and if someone feels that their water right could be impacted, they can file a protest. So an existing well owner may file a protest and say, look, if this new well is drilled, I think it could harm my well, and then the Division of Water Rights will look at that as part of their process to see if the new well could impact the old well. If there could be impact, then the change application may not get approved, or other terms or limitations could be put on the approval to make sure that the existing well is protected.
We hear about mountain runoff merging into a river, which then emerges into another river, and eventually to the Colorado River, which we read provides water to Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and California. How is that administered? I mean, there are multiple states, multiple jurisdictions. It seems like a very complex process. Is there one entity that sort of is the source of power and decision-making?
When it comes to interstate rivers like the Colorado River, there are compacts or agreements that have been entered into by the various states. So with the Colorado River, there's the Colorado River Compact that was entered into by 7 states as well as Mexico, because the Colorado River ends in Mexico, that divided out the water between the various states. So Utah has a specified allocation of water from the Colorado River, as do the other states. So generally, if you're talking an interstate source like that, then there is an agreement or a compact between the various states. The same applies for the Bear River that crosses through several states. There's a compact about that and how much water Utah gets.
And can these compacts change as change in water flow, change in climate, usage? And so that's a negotiation of the 7 members?
That's one of the big things that's happening right now with the Colorado River, is figuring out how to handle cuts during times of drought. So the states have to get back together and figure out how that's going to work. And as you might imagine, that's a big process involving a lot of politics, but it is something that has to happen and is happening.
The West is currently experiencing a pretty severe drought, as are we. How do laws change over time to deal with water shortages, which seems like it's a kind of roll of the dice every year as to what our water supply is going to be?
Yeah. So Utah water law changes slowly, and I think it was designed that way. It's more of like a really large barge that turns slowly. I think the reason for that is because a lot of people's livelihood depends on water. We don't want things to change every year and nobody knows what's going to happen. But laws have been changing to account for climate change, for droughts. So you've seen a lot of things happen in recent years and continue to happen. Generally, in the legislature each year, we might see 8, 10, 12 water bills. This last year, there were...
Every session?
Every session. Last year, there were over 40. With the drought really prompted a lot of people to take a hard look at things. And so there's always tweaks and adjustments being made. But it is something that turns slowly and purposely so.
You mentioned last year there were 40 proposed bills. How many of those would work their way through the legislature?
Over 30 of them, I don't have the exact number. If my recollection is right, over 30 of them actually passed through.
And is it possible to explain to our viewers what kind of impact that would have on all the water users?
Yeah. So just one bill in particular, one has to do with secondary water metering. So historically in the past here in Utah, secondary water, when I say secondary water, I mean watering lawns and gardens. So outdoor water use at homes and businesses. A lot of secondary water has been provided without metering, right? You paid a flat amount and you used as much or as little water as you wanted. There's a lot of water savings to be had if we meter people so people know how much they're using. Even if you don't charge them more, just by telling them how much they're using and making people think about it saves 20 to 30%. And so for several years now, there's been a push to try to meter secondary connections. Of course, funding is a big deal because the cost to do this has been estimated just under $500 million. But this year there was some legislation passed. They had some funding from the federal government, and they put $250 million towards water metering, secondary water metering, and they have upped the timetable. They want all secondary water connections metered by 2030 here in Utah.
Well, is there one ultimate solution?
No, there's not one solution. This is a problem, a multifaceted problem. There's a lot of interests, a lot of stakeholders involved. You have farmers, you have cities, you have environmentalists, you have ski industry. I mean, just everybody uses water, and everybody has different viewpoints on how water should be managed and used. And the answers to Utah solutions or to Utah's problems are going to be varied. There's lots of different things that can be done. You've got water metering. You've got Rip the Strip programs. You've got
What is that?
Rip the Strip is taking out park strips. So right now, the area between the sidewalk and the street that nobody's having picnics or playing soccer on that 5 feet of grass. but a lot of water goes to park strips. And so the idea is to take out the turf and replace it with rock or native vegetation or xeriscaping, something that uses little to no water. And so there's funding being put up to help rip the strips, they call it. And really it doesn't change the usefulness of your yard or anything like that, but saves water by not having to water that 5 feet of grass that nobody uses.
Well, is conservation the sort of the ultimate salvation to this very serious issue?
Ultimately, that's going to be the big issue is conservation. Because
and does the legislature or other jurisdictions have the legal authority to limit the use of water, whether it's consumable water or watering our lawns? Is there existing law today that the legislature or others could say, you have X gallons of water allocated to this household per week or per month? Or is that a little extreme?
No, that is something that water providers have to do, particularly in seasons of drought. The water district that I get my water from, for example, they've had to go on restrictions this year. We can only water 2 times each week because that's all the water there is. Now, people could water 4 times a week, but that means we'd run out of water in August and not have any water the rest of the irrigation season. So it's a matter of practicality to put limitations on those so everyone has water to get to the end of the season, albeit less.
What about recycling some water? Is that a serious way of conserving?
Yeah, water reuse is another tool that's in the tool belt to conserve water. You're seeing more and more of those in Utah. Frankly, without going into a lot of detail, that's an area of law that could be tweaked to make it even more useful. But water reuse is something that you'll see more and more of as we go along, particularly as the technology evolves. For a long time, the cost of reusing water, it just didn't make financial sense. But as water gets scarcer and scarcer and the technology gets better and better, it'll become more financially viable to use to do more water reuse.
I guess I have the question of enforcement. How does a jurisdiction enforce, for example, if you choose to water 4 times a week versus 2 times a week, how do they enforce that?
Yeah. Well, I jokingly tell people, if you don't know what your water rights are, ask your neighbor, because they probably do. So a lot of, whether it's the state or a local entity, is relying on people to watch their neighbors and report if water is being used that they're not allowed to use. In the example of the water restrictions, if I were to water 4 times a week and the water district found out about that, first they'll give me a warning. And if I still continue to do it, then they will just shut off my water service.
Mm-hmm. Oh, really?
Yeah.
They would have the authority to shut off your water.
Yeah, and each entity can do its own thing. Some may fine you. Weber Basin, for example, has a series of fines. The first fine is like $100. The next time it's $200. The next time it's $500. And the next time they shut off your water. So it just depends on that entity. But it could be some sort of, usually it's a combination of warnings, fines, and shutting off water.
We have time for just a couple of more questions, Jeff. Is it safe to say that we will see major increases in the cost of water in the future?
If what I learned in economics in college is correct, then that's the case. So again, with supply and demand, our demand continues to go up. We continue to have children. Our economy is doing well. And as long as we want to have a good economy and keep having children, that means we're going to have to find better ways to use our water. And the demand's going to continue to go up. The supply is not really going anywhere. There's 2 major projects left to do in Utah, 2 major water projects. The Lake Powell pipeline you've probably heard of that will take water from Lake Powell over to the St. George area. And then you have the Bear River project, which is designed to bring water from the Bear River down to the Wasatch Front. After those 2 projects are done, that's really the end of water projects in Utah.
Are both those projects going to be completed?
We shall see. The St. George Pipeline is slated to go first, and so they're still working on that. But from what I can tell, it will happen.
It appears as though it will.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I have one more question for you, and that is, I'm asking you to put on your fortune teller hat. Will we have sufficient water to meet the needs of a growing region for the foreseeable future?
The short answer, I think, is yes. Our ancestors and predecessors here in the state did a very good job of thinking into the future and planning for us. When the pioneers first showed up, one of the very first things they did, and there's a plaque about this in downtown Salt Lake if you go look at it, one of the very first things they did is they started building ditches and canals. And later generations did big water projects to help. So you got the Central Utah Project, the Weber Project, building these dams, reservoirs, pipelines that they didn't need at the time, but they knew we would need down the road. And so our challenge now is we have to be forward thinking like they did and come up with solutions and ideas of how to better manage our water and use our water so that there is water for our children and their children going forward. And I believe that will happen.
Well, that's a good way to end our show, Jeff. We appreciate your time in addressing a pretty serious, complex subject. That concludes this episode of Stringham Real Estate Edge. Today's program was brought to you by Stringham Schools, educating real estate professionals since 1989. Visit stringhamschools.com to learn more. We want to thank today's guests, and don't forget to tell us what you think in the comments section below. I'm Gary Barnes, and I'll see you on the next episode of Stringham Real Estate Edge.